Just a second, I will, yeah.
You have to record, okay.
Okay, so good afternoon, good morning, depending on time zones. And warm welcome to this session of Inca's Economics. Today I have the pleasure of listening to Florencia Morales from Universidad de Buenos Aires, present on gender, class, and labor market inequality, labor trajectories of working class women in the Buenos Aires Metropolitan Area, Argentina. And Florencia's work entangles questions of gender and class in the care, especially in the care sector, in informal care, formal and informal care. And she uses mixed methodologies to discover these themes. So please, Florencia, floor is yours.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Florencia Morales. I'm a predoctoral fellow at the Gino Germani Institute of Buenos Aires University. I would like to thank INCASI for the opportunity of doing this research stayed at Tàmpere University, and particularly to Sandra, Pedro, and Eduardo for inviting me to be part of this project. I also want to thank the University of Tàmpere and Anita for receiving me. Today, I will be present a work in progress of my thesis with the aims of sharing my preliminary findings and receiving feedback and suggestions for your comments. In my research, I analyzed the labor trajectories of working class women in metropolitan area of Buenos Aires with a focus on how gender, social class, and informality influences their participation in the labor market. My research seeks to understand how this dimension, especially the intersection between gender and social class, impact the way women enter the workforce, with special attention to the persistent or informality and precariousness condition. I'm interested in analyze how the labor trajectories are shaped over time, exploring whether they are segmented process between formality and informality, or whether they are more fluid. Furthermore, I try to comprehend how women themselves interpret and ascribe significance to their trajectories, consider how gender and class inequality are expressed in their experience. I changed the slide. You can see it, the objectives. Yes?
Okay. Yeah.
I continue. These presentations seek to provide a preliminary analysis of the labor trajectory of working class women in metropolitan area of Buenos Aires. The focus is in two key sectors: domestic services and home-based elderly care, both of which are highly feminized, predominantly informal, and deeply embedded within Argentina's working class labor market. The main objectives of this presentation are as follows. First, to provide a general framework for understanding how class, gender, and informality interacts in Argentina. Second, to describe the domestic service and home-based elderly care workforce in Argentina, focus on their working condition, typical job types, and the level of formality and informality in their employment. Third, to compare the distribution of women and men across different segments of working class and identify the most common occupation for her gender in Buenos Aires. Fourth, to examine the profiles and the labor trajectories of domestic work in Buenos Aires, and finally, to describe the mechanisms of access to domestic works and elderly care, including the role of personal networks, trust, and community tie that often mediate entry into these jobs. Well, now I'm going to share with you a conceptual framework. This study focuses on working class sectors, whether informality and precariousness employment are most concentrated. These areas allows us to explore how class and gender inequalities intersect and shapes access to work and labor conditions. The relationship between gender and class stratification is reflected in the social division of labor, in which inequality distribution of pay and unpaid work by genders form the foundation of socioeconomic inequalities. This division genders two key mechanisms of disadvantages: occupational segregation and wage discrimination. Informality in the labor market is a major manifestation of this inequality, with women being overrepresented in precarious and unregistered jobs. This analysis of labor trajectories shows how the intersection of gender and class produce specific forms of inequality, particularly in sectors such as domestic works and elderly care. This historically feminizes and working class occupation and often shaped by informality and precarious employment conditions. Also, migration, status, and class of origin are important dimensions to consider in these studies. Well, now my data and methodology. In this analysis, as Anita says, I combine quantitative and qualitative data collected at different moments in time. The quantitative component is based on survey on social class and life histories in metropolitan area of Buenos Aires, carried out by our research group at Gino Germani in 2016. This survey includes information from 1,042 individuals between 25 and 65 years old, using a multi-stage probabilistic sample to provide representative estimates for a metropolitan area population. For this study, we draw on social demographic data and complete work histories, including details about the registration status of all jobs. Using this data, I will first present a synchronic analysis showing how women and men are distributed according to different segments of working class, along with the most common occupation for each gender. Then I will move to a diachronic analysis to trace the labor trajectory of women employed in domestic works at the time of the survey. And the quantitative and the qualitative component, which is still in progress, draw on in-depth interviews conducted in 2024 with working class women from different age groups who hold the same type of jobs as those surveyed in the questionnaire. For reason of time, I will present a selection of this material. In particular, I will highlight the role of personal networks, trust, and community connection in accessing domestic and care work. Well, now I will contextualize in the women's position in Argentina labor market, like you have a general context. In Argentina, the labor market shows persistent gender inequalities visible in three main dimensions. First, there is an unequal distribution of paid and unpaid work. Second, strong occupational segregation between men and women. And third, women, especially those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, face major barriers to accessing formal and stable employment. Against this backdrop, This presentation focuses on Argentina's largest metropolitan area, which concentrates about the third of the national population, to explore how these generous dynamics unfold within the urban labor market. About occupational segregation. This remains a defining feature of Argentina labor market. Women are concentrated in care, health, and education, while working-class women are particularly overrepresented in domestic and care service jobs. These occupations are typically low-pay, high feminized, and socially undervalued. Another key feature in the east of the labor market is the high level of informality among women workers, especially those with lower level of education or more disadvantaged backgrounds. Today, nearly half of employed women work in informal jobs, about 43% compared to 40% of men. This limits the access to labor rights and social protection, reinforcing inequalities in jobs, security, and income. And care work, both paid and unpaid, remain the main form of labor market participation for lower income women. However, it is characterized by lower wages and high informality, restricting access to rights such as pension and maternity leaves. According to the survey of unpaid work and time use, women perform over 75% of domestic tasks without pay. This unpaid labor is a major barrier to their participation to the formal labor market, as caregiver responsibilities consume much of their time, often pushing them toward informal employment and perpetuating inequality. Well, now I show some key dimensions of domestic work in Argentina. As I mentioned, domestic work continues to be one of the main sources of employment for women in Argentina. In 2023, around 50% of employed women work in this sector, which is still marked by a very high level of informality. Nearly three out of very 4 domestic workers are not formally registered. Although Argentina has a legal framework for domestic workers, including those who provide non-therapeutic home-based care for older adults and people with disabilities, working condition is practice remains precarious. Many domestic and care workers still face low pay. What? Okay. I don't. Many domestic and care workers still face low pay, long hours, and high turnover, and they often do not benefit from the full protections the law mandates. Unlikely in other countries where home care works is professionally or regulated, in Argentina remains largely informal and inexperience-based. Rather than receiving formal training, workers usually learn through practice and personal networks, which limits their opportunity to access better jobs or formalize their employment. In metropolitan area of Buenos Aires, migrant women, both for the other province and neighboring countries, represent a significant share of the workforce, adding another layer of vulnerability. Well, now we have looked at a broader context of gender inequalities in Argentina's labor market, let's move to the data. This table shows how women and men are distributed across 3 segments of working class, along with their most common occupation at the time of the survey in 2016. These class categories are based on Eric Wright framework adapting to Latin America context and distinguish between formal and informal proletarians and informal self-employed workers. To simplify the presentation for doing this ranking, occupation were grouped using the International Standard Classification of Occupation at a general level. What stands out clear when you look these rankings is a pattern of horizontal segregation. Women are mainly concentrated in cleaning and caregiving jobs, roles traditionally associated with them. Domestic work, in particular, emerging as one of the main occupations among working class women, while many are also employed in commerce. Women remain largely absent for male-dominated sectors. Women not only perform most unpaid care workers, but also overrepresented in paid caregiving jobs. This shows how the feminization of care extends from the household into the labor market. Men, in contrast, occupy in a wider range of occupations. Through these are still largely male-dominated. From a class perspective, women are more concentrated in informal proletarian segments, while men are more often self-employment. Finally, it's worth noting that the analysis also includes people who were not employed in 2016, but have previous work experience. For example, we include in this ranking housewives, who had worked at some point in the past in order to have a large number of cases to analyze. Well, now I will focus on the domestic and basic elderly care workers. In this graphic shows the characteristics of 93 domestic workers and home-based elderly caregivers we surveyed. Based on our survey, the domestic working sectors consist predominantly of adult women, with the largest proportion being 33 to 54 years old. This suggests that the sector is primarily composed of women in their prime working years. Regarding to the place of birth, a significant proportion of workers originate from Metropolitan Area of Buenos Aires, 38.7%, and another provinces in the country, 40.9%, highlighting the strong internal migration component. Additionally, 22.8% of workers come from neighboring countries, primarily Paraguay. This underscores the important role that migrant women, both internal and foreign, play in sustaining the domestic work and caregiving sectors, and they often find it one of the few viable avenues for labor market integration in context of inequalities. In terms of education, most workers have low educational attainment. Nearly half did not finish secondary school, about 18%. have complete primary education, 40% complete primary, and around 23% did not complete secondary. Only a small group, probably the 16%, finished secondary or higher education. Within this group, some have specific trainings like therapeutic companions or medical visitors, and they tend to hold more formal jobs with better conditions. The next slide, I will show you the labor trajectory of these domestic and home-based care workers. I show these two charts that show the employment situation of these 93 domestic workers. In the first chart, indicates that 72% of domestic workers belongs to informal proletariat, while only 28% belongs to the formal proletariat. This highlights a strong predominance of informality within these sectors. In the second chart, shows workers' labor trajectories according to their job registration. The large majority, 58.1%, have stable informal trajectories, meaning that they have worked continuously without formal registration. 32.3% have mixed trajectories, alternating between formal and informal jobs, while only 9.7% have stable formal trajectories. Overall, both charts reflect the high level of informality and job instability in domestic works in Buenos Aires, with few workers enjoying stable formal and formal employment. Well, let's pass to show the entire labor trajectories of these workers. In this and the next slide, I will show you two sequence plot basis on retrospective information collected through our survey. Both graphics present the complete labor trajectory of women workers from Buenos Aires, who at the time of the survey in 2016 were employed as domestic workers. Each lines represent the entire work history of women. The first plot refers to home-based caregivers, while the second shows domestic service workers. The horizontal axis indicates the age at which each woman began her labor trajectory, and the color segments represent the different occupations held throughout her life, classified according the ESCO 08 occupational codes. The vertical axis groups the trajectories according the predominant type of employment, formal, informal, or mixed. These plots allow us to compare the sequence and diversity of occupation that shapes women labor trajectories and to identify patterns of continue and change in their work experience across their life. Starting some reflections. First, in both graphics, we can see that labor trajectories begins at very young ages, often before 20, suggesting an early entry into the labor market. Second, in the first graph, many trajectories ends with long periods in light and dark green, corresponding to institutional caregivers and home-based caregivers. In several cases, these jobs extend through most of adult life. That indicates a tendency for occupational stability within the care sectors, even when employment remains largely informal. In the second graph, here, dark blue represent domestic workers dominates most trajectories, often starting in the early adulthood around age 20 or even early, and continue into later working life. This shows that domestic work constitutes the main occupation in the labor trajectory of most women in these groups. Some trajectories include short periods of job, such as cooking, cellars, sewings, but these are usually intermittent or transitionally between long stretches of domestic works. And finally, both graphs shows that many trajectories begin in diverse occupation, represented by a variety of colors, but tend to converge through for care of domestic work later in life. In the first graph, early occupation includes includes seamstress, salesperson, agricultural workers, or cookers, which are later replaced by caregiving roles. In the second graph, combination appears with jobs such as kitchen assistant, laundress, factories, and street vendors, and but almost all trajectories eventually consolidates in domestic service. This suggests an horizontal rather than upward occupational mobility among low skills and highly feminized occupation. Let's now look the mechanisms of access to employment among domestic and care workers. According to the survey, over 60% of domestic workers found their jobs through personal connection, such as neighbors and family members, which suggests that women primarily find employment through these informal networks. In these networks, social capitalists, trust-based relationships, reputation, and support for acquaintances operate as central resources for finding works. This reinforces the idea that, rather than institutional channels, trust networks are the main mediatory in the labor market integration of women in these sectors. From a gender perspective, WAR describes how women from working class backgrounds establish tight networks based on close relationships with families, neighbors, and friends. These networks help women navigate daily life, but offer limited opportunities for improvement. The author suggests that social capital should be understood not only as a useful resource, but also as a tool that, due to power structure of inequality, tends to reproduce existing social conditions. Now, I will present the qualitative section in which I'm working on. This slide presents experts for interviews that illustrate how some working class women enter employment through personal networks. In this case, Monica, she's a hairdresser and home-based care worker, but she's retiring, but she still continues working until today. She emphasized that everything in her life has been thanks to word of mouth, highlighting how this informal network dynamics has been crucial for entering employment. For example, she said, "My knowledge of my client came from words of mouth. I have always worked in neighborhood. I have lived in the neighborhood since I was born." Her story shows how neighborhood networks create opportunities and sustain livelihoods. By building close relationships in her community, Monica has maintained her hairdressing business and generate other income sources such as commission-based sale. Throughout her life, word of mouth has been her main access mechanism, connecting her to shops in hairdressing, sailings, caregiving, and other informal activities. Her experience illustrates how trust-based social networks often replace formal or institutional channels in the search of working. And there you can read another of the testimonies she told us in the interview. And then I have another case to show you from Sylvia. She's retired and her last jobs were home-based care workers, and she was a nanny too. Sylvia accounts shows how employment opportunities in care work often emerging through informal recommendation and trust-based relationships. She repeatedly describes being contacted by others, neighbors, acquaintances, or relatives who offer her jobs when she most needs them. This pattern reflects a strong dependence on community ties, where reputation and reliability circulates by word of mouth. In Sylvia's cases, this dynamic is closely linked to the nature of her work. Along her labor trajectories, she has primarily been employed in home-based elderly care, a sector where personal trust is essential. Rather than actively seeking employment, Sylvia's access to work, relays, and or being recognized as trustworthy and capable within her local network. Each now jobs built upon the previous one, as employers recommend her to others, creating a chain of opportunities sustained by personal trust rather than formal proceedings. Her story illustrates how, in context of informality, social networks operate on both safety nets and requirement challenge, shaping women's enter into paid care work. These two samples and these testimonies illustrate informal ways of accessing employment, all linked to the importance of informal networks and social capital in women's labor market integration, particularly in the context of domestic and caregiving workers. Trust networks not only mediate between supply and demand for work, but also legitimate access to employment. In this context, reputation functions as a symbolic capital. Reliability not only opens doors, but also becomes a responsibility that must be maintained. These neighborhood networks, based on informal relationship, allows trust to be transferred without a direct connection between the person recommending and the one hearing. For many women from working class background, access to employment is not so much dependent on the formal labor market, but on personal relationships that intersect the labor, domestic, and community spheres. The lack of formal channels for accessing these jobs and the dependence on personal recommendation are common characteristics that reinforce inequality in the labor sectors, perpetuating both informal conditions and limited opportunities for mobility. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize that this analysis is in an ongoing process. I am still working on the qualitative analysis and the interviews I conduct, and there are several lines of research I need to explore further. In particular, I'm interested in exploring the various ways women access employment in this sector, especially in domestic and care work. Other fundamental aspect I want to investigate further is job transition, how women move within these sectors, how they change jobs, and what factor influences those decisions. I am also interested in better understanding working relationship and these areas, such as how working conditions and salaries are negotiated and the daily conflict that arise. Finally, I want to delve deeper into women's experience and expectations regarding their works. What do they hope to achieve through their jobs? How do they perceive opportunities for job mobilities? These are some of the questions I will continue to explore. This analysis is only the beginning, and I hope to continue providing more information on these important issues for understanding the working realities of women in invisible sectors. Thank you for listening.